Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to have you join us today for the offer holders and to give you an insight into our department, the work that we do, and what life is like in the biochemical engineering department here at UCL, and hopefully enthuse you as to why we genuinely believe this is the industry of the future, and hopefully evidence that and demonstrate why we believe that's the case. Perhaps some background to myself first. So my name is Dr. Kasim Rafiq. I'm one of the senior lecturers within the department at UCL, and I've got an interesting background because back in 2004, I myself was a student within the department, so I was in exactly your situation where I was an undergraduate student at UCL, decided I've got maths, chemistry, biology and physics as A-levels and thought, what do I want to do? Didn't really want to do medicine. My parents wanted me to do medicine, but I didn't really want to do medicine. Wanted to apply my skills and thought, okay, well actually, what is there that allows me to continue with the biology and the chemistry, but also bring in some of the engineering and the maths and the physics? And I thought, biochemical engineering, and that's a fantastic sounding degree title. What it meant at the time, I didn't know, and that's the first question I'll be asking you is, what do you think biochemical engineering actually is? But then it transpired that actually it was the only degree program I found that was available that allowed me to continue my skills in those different disciplines, and there was a genuine kind of industry and career opportunities afterwards. So I did the 4-year MEng program, graduated in 2008, and I then made the decision to leave UCL and continue my research activity. So I did a PhD at Loughborough University, and then had a fellowship, and decided to focus, and you'll see what I mean about cell and gene therapy, decided to focus on what I think are the next generation of medicines, and then had the opportunity to come back to UCL as a senior lecturer to lead the research activity and the teaching activity around cell and gene therapy. So I'll come on to some of that as well. So what I'd like to do is kick off with the question, and perhaps to the students themselves, as to what do you think biochemical engineering actually is? Does anyone want to hazard their own opinion as to what biochemical engineering actually is, or why you might have applied for a degree within the department? And there's no right or wrong answer. When I first decided to take this degree program, for me, I had no idea what it meant, I'll be honest. So, and I'm sure maybe some of you might be in that situation as well. But does anyone want to hazard a guess? Creation of new medicines? Absolutely. You were going to say something here? Absolutely. So it's really a combination of those things and other aspects as well, where we really want to start applying biological principles or utilizing biology and the engineering principles to develop new products or new ways of addressing major global issues. So one of the key aspects is many people are familiar with chemical engineering, and chemical engineering is an established industry where it's focused on developing new petrochemicals, new sources of energy, and so on and so forth. People are generally familiar with biotechnology, which is kind of the application to some extent of biology, or looking at understanding the biology to a greater extent so that we can make scientific advancements. And biochemical engineering really is a combination of the two, where we're trying to take those biological discoveries and really bring them about, and using engineering principles, start to develop new products, new processes, and ways of being able to make a difference globally. And I mean that in every possible sense of the word, because when we look at biochemical engineering, for me, I see now the challenges that we face as a society, a global society, are ones that I think will be solved primarily by good biochemical engineers. You look at climate change, and one of the big issues that we have in terms of climate change and future energy sources is the need to be able to develop sustainable sources of energy or sources of fuel, and bio-based sources are becoming increasingly important, to the extent that the Institution of Chemical Engineers, so if you do a chemical engineering degree in the UK or a biochemical engineering degree in the UK, normally they're accredited by the IChemE, and all our degree programs are accredited by the IChemE. The IChemE now has a huge focus. This wasn't the case when I was a student, but they now have a huge focus called Biofutures Initiative. So for them, they realize they can't continue to constantly be promoting chemical engineering solely. For them, it is now about the Biofutures Initiative, and that's now very high on government's radar as well, not just the UK government, but globally, in the idea that actually we have to be able to think about how we can implement and utilize the biological principles to be able to make a difference. And that's on climate change. Then there's the other aspects that, as a society, we're now living longer than ever. There's a recent statistic that we have over 14,000 individuals in the UK who are greater than 100 years old. And that statistic, or that number, is likely to increase over the next 20 to 30 years, which is fantastic news. But often, what we tend to see is, although the quantity of life is increasing, that's not necessarily being mirrored by the quality of life. So often we're living longer, but actually the quality of life is decreasing. And in order to ensure that we can match that quantity with quality of life, we have to be able to develop new therapeutic solutions to things such as diabetes, to things such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, and neurodegenerative diseases, but also things like cancer and cardiovascular indications as well. And using existing pharmaceutical methods to be able to address these types of conditions just isn't feasible. We can't develop appropriate small molecule approaches or chemical-based approaches to developing new therapies. So we have to think radically different about what the next generation of therapies are. And within the department specifically, but within the field as a whole, there's a push towards developing those new therapies. And I'll give you some examples of what we're doing and what's happening in the industry as we're proceeding in this space. So before I do move on, the question is, what is a biochemical engineer, and can anyone recognize anyone on the screen? So hopefully there's maybe one that you do recognize. I'd be surprised if you know all of them, but hopefully there is one that you do recognize. You may not know their name, but I'm sure as soon as I mention the name, you'll know who he is. And this is a he in this instance. Does anyone recognize the gentleman on the left? Was awarded a Nobel Prize for something significant. Does anyone know Sir Alexander Fleming? What's he famous for? Penicillin, discovery of penicillin, absolutely. And for that, quite rightly, he was awarded the Nobel Prize. Does anyone know the two gentlemen next to Sir Alexander Fleming? The reason I mention them is they were also recipients and shared the Nobel Prize Award for penicillin, but no one knows their names. So their names are, so this is Sir Howard Florey, and this is Sir Ernst Chain. So they both shared in the award of the same Nobel Prize that Sir Alexander Fleming was awarded, because although Sir Alexander Fleming did indeed discover penicillin, and we know the kind of the infamous studies that he undertook and the experimental investigations and so on, it was really Sir Howard Florey and Sir Ernst Chain that actually developed a manufacturing process for it and actually thought about how do we take this to the large scale. And I think that's often sometimes that gets lost in all of the scientific discoveries, that we can discover the cure for cancer, and in some instances we have, and I'll give examples of how we have. But the challenge is then, how do we make that accessible to a global population? How do we get these discoveries and actually make it meaningful? And sometimes that's the worst thing, when you know you can cure something or you can address a problem, but actually you can't make a meaningful difference because it's too expensive, it's too difficult, it's too challenging. And that's really where Sir Howard Florey and Sir Ernst Chain came to the fore, because what they focused on was taking this discovery of penicillin and then applying it to developing a manufacturing process so that actually thousands of people could benefit from this particular discovery. And I think a classic example, so there's a book actually written about this called Inside Florey's Lab Coat. So it's a non-fiction but kind of fictionalized to some extent account of how the discovery was made. And there's a fascinating anecdote within that book about a police officer who was cut by a thorn in his rose bush, as can happen to any of us, and within a couple of weeks it became infected and was on the verge of death. And this was at the time when they discovered penicillin and they were trying to get a process to manufacture it. So they had identified enough, or a method to produce enough penicillin, but it clearly wasn't enough to be able to cure the police officer. And so what they had to do was they had to isolate, and this may sound not particularly pleasant, but isolate his urine, concentrate the penicillin and re-administer the penicillin. That worked for a while as well, but it still wasn't enough, and ultimately that police officer passed away. And that shows you, something as small as getting a prick in your rose garden or rose bush 50, 60, 70 years ago, we're not talking over 100 years ago, we're talking about maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, could have resulted in death. And now the issues we face at the moment, we may be reverting back to that scenario, and there's a huge concern within the World Health Organization around the issue of resistance to antibiotics, and that's again one of the issues we're developing or addressing here at UCL. And then here on the right we have Margaret Hutchinson. So she was an American chemical engineer, and she developed the first pilot facility or pilot plant to actually manufacture penicillin at scale. So Sir Howard Florey and Sir Ernest Chain developed a process, but it wasn't a truly scalable process. So they developed a process that seemed to work, but they couldn't treat 10,000 patients. The first time that was the case was when Margaret Hutchinson effectively established and developed a facility over in the US and led the development of that facility to manufacture penicillin at scale. And now we don't think twice when it comes to taking antibiotics. So that's out there. And then in terms of what do biochemical engineers actually make? So I mentioned quite specifically about antibiotics, but the trillion-dollar industry at the moment is biopharmaceuticals. So things like human proteins that can cure certain conditions. How many of you know what erythropoietin is, or have come across erythropoietin? If I shorten it, I'm sure some of you would have. Does anyone know what EPO is? What's EPO? Or what's EPO famous for? There's a certain cyclist who was very familiar, very fond of EPO. Yes, that cyclist. Lance Armstrong, indeed. So Lance Armstrong was known, and many other cyclists, as taking EPO. So EPO is a human therapeutic protein, one of the best-selling medicinal products of all time. It's a trillion-dollar product. It wasn't primarily used by cyclists and for blood doping. It was mainly used because people who had significant blood loss, by taking this human protein, it would enable the body to regenerate its blood cells, which is why for cyclists it was great, because you could generate more red blood cells, increase your oxygen capacity by just taking this particular protein. But so biopharmaceuticals are a trillion-dollar industry, and so you look at all of the major companies globally, companies like GSK, Pfizer, Genentech, Amgen, and so on and so forth. They develop various biopharmaceuticals which are human proteins or recombinant proteins. But now we're starting to develop immunotherapies, which I'll come on to, which are cancer-based therapies. We also have, and this is my area of expertise, around regenerative medicine and cell and gene therapies, which again we believe are the next generation of therapeutics, to be able to start to treat things like cancers, diabetes, cardiovascular conditions, and so on. And the other big area is vaccines, and in the session this afternoon, the students will undertake a workshop or activity with Rana, who sat there at the back, around vaccine development and what we think about with vaccines. But again, vaccines have been transformative. Things like tuberculosis or things like smallpox are now almost completely eradicated. In the case of smallpox, have been completely eradicated through the emergence and development of vaccines. But it's not just the medicines. As I mentioned, there's a big focus as well on addressing sustainable sources of fuel, so things like bio-based fuels, and alternatives to petrochemicals, so things like biobutanol, bioethanol. And now with the emergence of synthetic biology, we can start to really engineer and design specific constructs to start to tailor nature to try and develop new therapies or new solutions to existing challenges. So what are biochemical engineers actually doing? So as we speak, we have research within this department, and you'll get to see the facilities where we're developing stem cell therapies, not just stem cell therapies. I'm also going to come on to something called T-cell or CAR-T therapies, which are really exciting both clinically and commercially. And that's a lot of the work that I'm involved in. We have lots of colleagues who are looking at this issue of plastic. So one of the things I think that's really come onto this scene in the last couple of years with Blue Planet 2 is the amount of plastic we generate and waste, and that ends up in the oceans in many instances, or in landfills. How can we develop solutions? And actually, one of the main ways that people are developing solutions are using bio-based methods to address these challenges. There's a big activity around water purification. I think as a natural resource, water is critical to our survival. But one of the issues we find globally is that many of our water sources are now being contaminated, either through our own actions or through natural incidents, and so therefore we have to start seeing how we can develop water purification techniques, but also, and I think this is the other key point, responses to pandemics. So when we hear of things like SARS, or we hear of bird flu, or whatever it might be, thankfully we don't have the Spanish flu outbreak that happened many years ago, because now we have responses which are led by biochemical engineers, and that's some of the work that you'll be doing this afternoon about how we can respond quickly and appropriately to these emerging pandemics. So in terms of what biochemical engineering actually is, it really is how do we take these discoveries that happen at the very small scale, at the milliliter scale, and take it through a manufacturing process up to the relevant scales where we call upstream, so actually manufacturing the cells or the product, and then ultimately how do we purify and get the final product at the end, and actually have it in a format that patients, if it's a medicine, can take as a pill, as a pharmaceutical, as an intravenous bag, whatever it may be. But this is now what's increasingly becoming the key type of therapeutic that is going to be on the market, and we're developing strategies toward the idea of what's known as vein-to-vein manufacture, where you can take cells from the patient and deliver back to that very same patient. So it's a personalized therapeutic. Now, 15, 20 years ago, it was unheard of to actually even consider this as being a manufacturing paradigm. But this is now a reality. There are now some therapies which have been approved for use in the UK and in parts of Europe and the US, where they are truly personalized, where we take the patient's cells and we can re-engineer the cells and then deliver them back to the patient to treat certain forms of cancer in this example. And I'll show you a video which highlights this even further, but this is the research we're specifically focused on, that I'm specifically focused on at the moment, because this is where we see big opportunities to address some of these major conditions. So what does a biochemical engineer actually do? So what is our research within the department, and how do we bring that into the teaching? So in terms of one of the key activities within the department, led by various colleagues, I mentioned about antibiotics being one of the greatest ever inventions, and I think the BBC had a survey last year, and they had a program, a series, and it was found that the greatest British invention ever, you know, you had the internet on the one hand and the World Wide Web, the other was, the one that came out top were antibiotics, because they'd estimated it saved over 2.5 billion lives over the course of its invention. But the challenge we now have is that actually, since the 1980s, there have been no new antibiotics discovered. And we're finding that the microorganisms are developing resistance to the existing antibiotics. And so now there's a major global initiative to see how we can develop new antibiotics or address some of the issues around resistance. And that's work that we're developing internally within the department, and we're looking at the manufacturing processes associated with developing new antibiotics. The other activity is around, I mentioned, and this is work that I lead, is around regenerative medicine, which is the idea that we could potentially develop or create organs outside in the lab and then transfer back to patients. So this is a cadaveric trachea. So this is a trachea that was taken from a person who had donated their body to science after their death. And this was Claudia Castillo. So she was a patient who had a damaged trachea, and had she not had a replacement, there was no other treatment option available, she would have died from her condition. Using this cadaveric trachea and taking some cells from Claudia herself, we could grow Claudia's cells in the lab on the trachea itself, and then after a period of time, once the cells of Claudia had been fully submerged the trachea, implant it back into Claudia, and this was a major success. And to this day, this happened back in 2011, and UCL was involved in this research along with Bristol University and 3 or 4, an Italian hospital and a few other European partners. This was a major success, and the patient and Claudia is still alive to this day. There have been some complications, but the fact that she would have died within a matter of months if she hadn't received this trachea, I think is a huge success from that perspective. But in many instances, it's also a failure, because this procedure cost £7 million. Now, I go back to that point. We can address these issues, and in some instances, we've shown that the science is certainly proven. But if it costs £7 million per patient, there is no healthcare agency globally that will ever approve £7 million per treatment per patient. It just wouldn't make economic or financial sense. Certainly the patients would love to have it, but it doesn't make sense for governments to be able to fund that type of application. And so the major cost associated with this was actually the cost of manufacturing the cells. And so the bioprocessing, the biochemical engineering was the major aspect that needed addressing. And that's again where we have lots of research to try and address that cost so we can bring the cost down for some of these therapies. But what I would like to, I've mentioned this a couple of times, is this idea of developing novel therapies and this idea of personalized therapies. And this is a specific example of now a recently approved product, what's known as a CAR T therapy. And I want to show you this video because I think it highlights exactly what we're trying to do, and I can explain where we are involved in this, but also how we integrate this into the teaching itself. So just some background, this was Emily Whitehead, who back in about 2011, 2012, was diagnosed with ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is a very aggressive form of blood cancer. And in pediatric patients, survival chances are normally quite good if you have a bone marrow transplantation or if you have chemotherapy. So in Emily's instance, she'd had bone marrow transplantation and it failed. She'd had 2 or 3 rounds of chemotherapy and it failed. And as you can see, she was practically on the verge of death if there was no other treatment option available. Had this happened 10, 15 years ago, she would have died. There was no other treatment option available. But now we're starting to develop new therapies, and then I'll let the video give you an indication as to what actually happened and what's been happening since. So that's, hopefully you could all hear that. That was Emily Whitehead's story, where she'd had leukemia come back twice, there's no other treatment option available, and through this unique and novel CAR T therapy where we could take Emily's own cells, re-engineer them in the lab so that it would now target the tumor cells and reinsert that back into Emily, she was completely cured of the cancer, and to this day her cancer hasn't come back. And the remission rates are incredible, to the point where we now actually think for certain forms of cancer we have a cure, because it's that good. So in many instances the remission rates are at 95%, and the data is incredible. And this is why now major companies, so the company, this was developed initially by a group of physicians and clinicians over at the University of Pennsylvania. It's now being bought out by Novartis, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies, and they're now manufacturing this, and it's approved for use in the UK. So if you have, or if someone has this in the UK, the NHS will actually cover the cost. The cost of this, however, per patient is $400,000. So again, it's still a major cost. And the reason why the NHS is happy to pay the $400,000 is because in the UK wants to be seen as a global leader in cell and gene therapy manufacturing, which is this area. That's one of the reasons. And also, there's only about 20 patients in the UK that would currently benefit from this treatment as it stands, which is why I think the government can bear that cost. But it's the cost of a house in anywhere apart from London, perhaps. It's the cost of, and there's not many people that can pay that cost themselves. And again, as biochemical engineers, our key activity is how to bring down that cost. But I like to show this image afterwards. So this was Emily 2 or 3 years after receiving the treatment with the then president of the US, Barack Obama. And just to give you some idea of Emily's own her own conviction and her own mentality, the president asked her, was there anything I can do for you when they met? And she said, there is one thing you can do for me. My school don't know I'm here today. Can you write me a letter to let them know I'm here? So that's the letter from Barack Obama, just saying, please excuse Emily from school, she was with me. But the challenge we now have is we know we can cure certain forms of cancer, but it's still very, very expensive. And it's down to the biochemical engineering and the manufacturing. And that's really where we come in. And so what I'd like to very quickly do is ask some of you to do a very quick activity, and this is a verbal thing. So this is often something you see on any of the cooking programs, whether it's MasterChef, whether it's Great British Menu or Bake Off, whatever, where they often have to produce a Michelin-starred dish. But the challenge is that they have to produce it for over 250 guests, or a large number of guests. So the challenge, what I'd like to do is ask you, what challenges do you think you would expect when you have to produce high quality food for a large number of guests? What challenges might you expect? Yes.
The quality consistent in every piece of meat.
Absolutely. The consistency for each customer, making sure that the quality is absolutely spot on. What else?
Just having the same preparation.
Absolutely, having the same preparation, so making sure you're using the same equipment, the same sources of food and so on, and your raw materials, absolutely. What else? Time, absolutely, making sure, so would you like to elaborate on time a little?
Or just getting everything at the same time ready.
Absolutely, making...
So hot.
Exactly. If you're producing a meal, you want to make sure that if it's meant to be hot, it's delivered hot at the right time to the paying customers. If it's a banquet, you want to make sure that everyone kind of receives it within about a 5-10 minute time period. If you have one table being served an hour earlier than the next, it doesn't work very well. Any others? Yes.
It has to look nice in the end.
Has to look nice. It has to be presentable. It has to be something that can be served to the customer at the expectation of a high quality dish that they would expect. So this is something I did one evening as I was sitting there watching one of these programs with my wife. One of the things I couldn't realize, the same challenges that they have in manufacturing 250 dishes, pretty much the same challenges we have, maybe slightly in phrased in a different way. So for example, large volume, having to produce one Michelin-starred dish is relatively straightforward. Having to produce, I say relatively straightforward, but for a Michelin-starred chef, I imagine it is, but producing 250 is a challenge. It's a large volume issue. Cost of goods and profit. If it costs you £30 per individual to produce the Michelin-starred dish, you can't charge customers £15 because otherwise you'll be making a loss on every dish. So making sure there's enough cost of goods, you might have one fantastic service, but you can't sustain the business and therefore produce this at scale if you aren't having sufficiently high cost of goods and profit margins. Precision cooking and plating, as we discussed, and that we have in precision manufacturing. Following a recipe. So often it's not just the head chef running around doing everything himself. He has to ensure that he's got appropriate staff and they are following a recipe. In our case, we follow standard operating procedures, ensuring the quality of the dishes, as was mentioned earlier. In our case, the quality of the cell product at the end. Make sure you've got enough time for each cooking step. If you know that it takes 5 minutes at the end to fry your salmon, but 2 hours to prepare your vegetables and you need certain bits of equipment, you need to make sure you've got all of that staggered and in place. And the same in our case, processing of each step, delivering on time at the appropriate conditions, as was mentioned, consistency for each customer, and in our case, for each patient, as was mentioned, having enough raw materials. If your supplier calls you up that morning and says, well, actually, the salmon wasn't great today, we didn't have a good catch last night, and so therefore we don't have enough salmon for you to be able to serve, that clearly is a problem that you need to try and have a solution for, and hopefully have risk mitigation for. And it's the same in our case. Ensuring hygiene. That's a critical one, so making sure it's hygienic and in our case, making sure it's sterile, having the correct tools and equipment. This is the one I love the most, tasting and smelling. Whenever you see any of these programs, they always say you should be tasting and smelling or tasting your food as you're going through the process. Make sure there's enough salt, it's seasoned properly and so on. I still remember there was one occasion when someone was meant to produce the dessert. It got to the end, they tasted it and realized actually instead of putting sugar, they're putting salt. If they just found out, if they tasted it in the first 5 minutes, they could have addressed that issue from the beginning. And it's in our case, it's about how do we sample the media? How do we check that the cells are growing as they expect them to? And then finally, having a multidisciplinary workforce. You've got chefs, apprentices, front of house waiters. In our case, we have biologists, engineers, technicians, computer scientists, and biochemical engineers bring all of these people together. So going back to then what biochemical engineering actually is, it's really a combination of the traditional sciences, so chemistry, physics, maths and biology, with the more applied activities, certainly engineering. A key area for us is a focus on the business and commercial aspects. Again, there's no point developing the cure for cancer if no one can benefit from that cure for cancer, if it's too expensive. Understanding the biochemistry and then ultimately how it's applied in a clinical setting through medicine. So in terms of our undergraduate degree programs, therefore, there's 3 main degree programs that we have on offer. So actually, for those of you, are there any students here that have applied for the BSc in bioprocessing? So we've got 3 people looking at the and are you on the science or management? Sorry, science and engineering or management and business streams? Science engineering? Management and Management, excellent. Okay, so as a department, we offer 3 programs. There's the B-Eng and the M-Eng in Biochemical Engineering. There's the BSc in Bioprocessing of New Medicines, which has a Science and Engineering stream, and there's a BSc Bioprocessing in Business and Management. So the Biochemical Engineering stream is really the core stream where people are expected to have maths as part of the requirements, and there's a focus on, so you do get to cover a lot of the business and management, and clearly obviously the biochemical engineering. With the BSc streams, however, we brought these on in the last 4 or 5 years because we realized some students didn't have maths, but they still wanted to do activity within the sector and do something that would be associated with bioprocessing or biochemical engineering, which is why we then created a separate science and engineering program and a business and management program that would allow students who had different A-levels to be able to take or be involved in some of the activity that we have within the department itself. So then in terms of the degrees in the department, so this kind of gives you an overview, a brief overview, and we'll make sure you can get a copy of these slides at the end if you would like, of the B-Eng and the M-Eng program. So it's very much focused around the engineering, and you cover things like thermodynamics in the first year and so on. You then have a selection of minors. So in the B-Eng and the M-Eng program, and this is across UCL engineering, so whether you do chemical engineering, civil engineering, we realize actually students often want to tailor their degree programs a little. And so across all of engineering, there's the opportunity to take different minors. So as a department, we offer a minor in regenerative medicine, and we also offer a minor in finance and accounting, because we realize some of our students, as much as we'd love them to be biochemical engineers at the end, they get snapped up by all the investment banks because they've got all the quantitative skills that are needed, and often get snapped up by the likes of UBS or Deutsche Bank, whatever it might be, over in Canary Wharf. So we offer a minor in that if students have a particular preference to move down into those areas. And going back to how we integrate our research activity into our teaching activity, so that video I showed you of CAR-T, we're actually manufacturing those very cells at the moment upstairs on our 5th floor. In terms of our teaching, just last week, as part of the regenerative medicine minor, the students who are on that would have gone through the manufacturing process last Wednesday actually, around the CAR-T therapy development, and what we're doing to try and improve that manufacturing process, to make it cheaper, to make it more cost effective, and to make it more reliable. And that is one of the strengths that we have within the department. Our research activity is very advanced, but we want to try and ensure that we bring that into our teaching, because we see a key role of our activity is developing the next generation moving forward. And then in your final year, there's often design projects which are based on real-life industrial case studies. And there's a range of different case studies that we often have within the program itself. Then there's the BSc Science and Engineering program, which takes some of the engineering elements but builds more on the biochemistry and the molecular biology. There's a focus in the final year of a research project, and there is a research project if you do the M-Eng. There is a research project in the 4th year on the biochemical engineering program, and there's a bio business plan case study which the engineers also take. And then to provide that level of tailoring to the degree program, you can also take optional modules across all of the departments that UCL modules can offer. And then finally, there's the business and management stream, which includes only the core engineering programs, but activities or modules, but then includes lots of modules from the School of Management, Science and Public Policy, and some language modules if you'd like. And then there's a similar research activity at the end. And then there is an option module available in year 2. So this is now for the M-Eng only. So in that final 4th year, if you do decide to take the M-Eng, and I'll come on to why the M-Eng is the route that I took as a student, and also why I think it might be of interest to many. So as part of the M-Eng, you can either do straight biochemical engineering for the full 4 years. You can include something like chemical engineering, so you can do 3 years of biochemical engineering and have your 4th year as chemical engineering. You can have your 3 years as biochemical engineering and then focus on business and management in your 4th year. You can do a study abroad. So one of my tutees is now at the National University of Singapore, and she's doing her study abroad year over there. We've had students go to MIT, students go to the University of Queensland. And then something we've introduced recently, and we're the only department to offer this as a 4th year option, where it's accredited by the IChemE, is that we actually offer a fourth year in industry. We offer a third year in industry as standard, but we also offer a fourth year in industry, and that's actually sometimes very advantageous, because a fourth year in industry means that a student can do their final year in industry. So we had this year actually, we've got students at GSK and Pfizer. One of my tutees was at GSK last year, and it's advantageous to sometimes have it in your fourth year, because you can do your fourth year in the company, and then you don't have to come back to UCL for another year. If the company really like you, and they did in that instance with that particular student, because they wanted to employ him and they're funding him to do a PhD now with us, because they really wanted to keep him, he could stay on at the company, come back for graduation for a week, and then go back to the company and continue working in his role. And we're the only university that offers that option and have it fully accredited by the ICME, so you can still get your chartership status at the end of it. So this is kind of funky diagram. This is why I think it might be better to send it across so you can have a look at it in more detail. But this diagram gives you an indication about, I mentioned about the integrated engineering approach across all of UCL. And the idea behind this is, and I'll break it down a little, but it might be better if you can see it up close and in person, is across all of UCL, one of the things that we're now renowned for, and the university has won multiple awards, or the Faculty of Engineering has won multiple awards in our teaching, is around this idea of integrated engineering. We realize that actually engineers, whether you're chemical engineer, biochemical engineer, civil engineer, electrical engineer, or in some cases computer scientists, there's many challenges that need an interdisciplinary approach. You don't just have chemical engineers solving the problems or biochemical. It often needs people to work together. So within the first year, there's shared modules and shared scenarios where they're given a case study, and you could be working with an electrical engineer, you could be working with a computer scientist, you could be working with a biochemical or a chemical engineer, and you work together to try and solve and address the scenario or the case study at hand. That's one of the aspects of the teaching. But there's also, as I mentioned, the idea of the minors, and the minor has been revolutionary. So it wasn't available when I was a student, and I wish it was, because it allows you to tailor your course, and it's more than just taking an optional module. It allows you, at the end, you can say, I've got biochemical engineering with a minor in whatever it may be. And across all of engineering, we have over 30 minors available, ranging, as a department, we offer regenerative medicine and finance and accounting. Other departments, for example, offer intelligent systems or connected systems or artificial intelligence. Other departments, such as biomedical engineering, offer one specifically in medical physics. There's some that are specialized in project management and so on. So each department, engineering department, offers their own minor. And the idea that it's structured so that if you're a biochemical engineer, you can take the minor in, let's say project management. And what that means is in your second year, you will take one module associated with project management, and in your third year, you'll take 2 modules from project management. And that will then complete the minor, and then you will have a degree at the end that says biochemical engineering with a minor in project management, for example. And again, the idea behind that is, so often for the regenerative medicine minor, which I lead, and I delivered the lecture last week, in there we had about 30 biochemical engineers, about 15 chemical engineers, about 5 or 6 civil engineers, a couple of computer scientists, and then we had some students from our arts and sciences degree program as well, where they can take any modules. So that really is quite unique, because it does force everyone to come together, and it depends on your interests and what you'd like to do. And that, I think, is a really unique activity that UCL Engineering provides, whichever engineering program you can do. And there's lots of information. So there's actually a minors fair where you get to visit all of the different stalls, see what they offer. All of the academics present about what their minor actually is. And for me, that's more realistic of what real life is like. You won't be working with experts in your field and your field only. You'll be working with lots of experts across multiple different areas. So how is the degree taught? So often people think universities operate in this way, where we have lots of students in one big lecture theatre, and there's an academic at the front who sits there and talks for hours on end, perhaps as I'm doing at the moment. But actually it's not. In many instances, this is how the degree program is taught within biochemical engineering. So one of the things we deliberately try to do is we try to limit our intake so we can maintain the quality of our programs. And one of the things we have as a department is we have over 25 academic members of staff. And the maximum we generally tend to take in any intake is about 60 students. So it means that actually you get about 1 academic member of staff per 3 students. I've been at other universities where it's almost 1 to 10, and there's a huge level in terms of how do you maintain the quality of a degree program. And much of our activity is actually students learning together. So there's lots of courseworks and case studies where students have time to spend in the labs, or they spend working together in real life practical scenarios. So these are all undergraduate students that you're seeing here. As we go around the tour, you'll see students actually in the labs who are our postgraduates, our MSc students. They're doing their pilot plant week, where they spend a week developing a process in the labs themselves. The undergraduates did that a month ago, and I led that. So they did that a month ago, and we awarded the prizes to the best team that did the best presentation at the end. But the idea is, through these engineering scenarios, and there's about 6 we do in the first 2 years, you actually have lots of hands-on time, lots of group working, and again, that's indicative of real life. We realize actually when our students previously used to go out into the real world, and in some instances they still do from other universities, they don't know how to work together. They don't know how to work in teams. Sometimes you have to work with difficult characters. And how do you manage that? And if you've never experienced it before, it can be quite tricky. So one of the things we do is make sure that actually it's a team-based activity. In many instances, there's individual weighting and marks as well. So we do look at the individual component as well to make sure that the marking scheme and marks reflect individual input. The other thing we often encourage our students to do is to be proactive and take the initiative. And as a department, we're fully supportive and encourage our students to take the lead through, for example, learning through research. So one of the things we've had now for a number of years is our students go to Parliament and present their research data that they've done as undergraduates. So this was an image from 2 years ago. Actually, this was last year, and this was an image from 2 years ago, back in 2018, where we had our students, undergraduates, and these are now our 3rd years, and these are current 2nd year crop, where we actually had our students go to Parliament and present their research to MPs and civil servants about what it is they're actually doing. And that's one of the things for us is it's not just, again, about how do they learn and how do they teach, but how do you present your data? How do you present to a scientific and a non-scientific audience? How do you present to policymakers? And that for us, we think are key skills. The other thing we encourage our students to do, and this is open to all of our undergraduates throughout their time here, is to take part in the iGEM competition. So this is an international competition where the finals take place over in Boston. So we fly out the students to Boston at no cost to them. And they get to be part of what's known as the iGEM team, which is a synthetic biology competition. And I have to say, without blowing our trumpet too much, we often do very well, where we often have our team competing globally on a global scale against multiple teams around the world. We often either get gold or silver in these competitions, competing against at least 30 to 40 to 50 other teams. And we have an academic who leads this activity, Dr. Darren Nesbeth. So there's an internal national competition, and then we have the international competition over in Boston, and that happens once a year. And again, we encourage our students to get involved and lead in some of that activity. But going back to what our students do, so a lot of the teaching is actually small group based. So this room itself is often used to teach in small cohorts, so we don't have large lecture theatres for every lecture or every module. There are some times when that may be needed, but in many instances we have small group learning. We have lots of casework or practical based learning, and students actually get their hands to, in the lab, growing stem cells or other cell types, and get the individual attention that we think is important to develop good quality graduates. And where do our graduates go? So our graduates often end up in the biotech sector. That's one of the key areas. Other areas, we often have students going to research and innovation. But at the same time, we realize that many of the skills we provide to our graduates are applicable for a whole range of different industries. And as I said, it's often one of the saddest things when I see some of our best biochemical engineers get snapped up by the likes of UBS and the investment firms and so on. But I realize actually it's a sign of quality of our degree program that actually these investment firms want our engineers because they know they have the right skill sets. And so that's something that we certainly encourage. We have many of our students going to the city, or they continue within the petroleum or the chemical engineering research field as well. And the average graduate starting salary is about £34,000, and higher if you do a PhD. So this was for the average starting salary for the biochemical engineers at the undergraduate level is 26,000. It's 34,000 at the MSc level, and then it's higher if you do the PhD. And then in terms of what they actually go on to do, as I mentioned, it's a range of different destinations, but the vast majority go on to do graduate level work or study when they graduate. And then in terms of our most recent graduates, so that would give you up-to-date information. So from the BSc program, we've had some who have gone on to become management consultants at Bank of America or Merrill Lynch. There's one who's gone on to become the industrial relations officer at Blue Latitude Health. Others who've gone on to do additional postgraduate studies, whether it's control of infectious diseases or international health management. And then there's the B-Eng and the M-Eng program. Many have gone on to become management consultants or business analysts. Many have gone into become the process engineers of the future, so at GSK, Eli Lilly, and so on. And then many also go on to stay in the department and continue to do an ND, an engineering doctorate, or a PhD. So this is one example of one of our students, Tom Sugden, who graduated, I think, back in 2007. So he graduated the year before I did. So he did a summer placement that we facilitated within the department. So we often have extensive contacts with industry. So many of our students go on to do industrial placements. He then graduated 2006. He got his first job within Jacobs Engineering, went over to Australia where he moved down under, came back to London. So he was working with a company called CSL, came back to London in 2011 where he got a job at Exmoor Pharma. Started to work on much larger, bigger projects, and he's now joined a company called Finesse and spending half his time over in San Diego leading some of the key cell and gene therapy research activity in the field. And this is another one of our students as well. So she did her A-levels in biology, chemistry, maths and physics. She did a year in industry in this instance. So she went over to Belgium, UCB Pharma, and she's still, I believe, at UCB Pharma, where she's now a UCB Pharma scientist. And she kind of gives a breakdown of the work that she's doing, how much lab work she's doing, and kind of where her career is moving forward to next around project management and so on in the biotech field. And this is kind of a quick snapshot of our alumni network. One of the great things we have as a department, particularly in the biochemical engineering sector, is the extent of our alumni network is unparalleled. So in every single major company in the sector and the small SME companies, we have graduates in various positions. I remember going to a meeting with a company called Sartorius, and I went in as an academic to discuss a research collaboration, and it was funny, around the table, out of 10 people, 7 were graduates from this department at UCL at different stages. Some were MSc graduates, some were PhD graduates, some were undergraduates. But throughout, there were 7 of us around the table, and we just effectively, it just became almost a reunion at some point as part of the discussion. But in terms of where our students often end up within the biotech or the chemical engineering sectors, it's all of the major companies, so the companies like AstraZeneca, GSK, MedImmune, Merck, Pfizer, and so on and so forth, but also in many instances the established chemical engineering companies, so Shell, BP, and so on. And what we're noticing is our graduates are being snapped up by the likes of BP and Shell and Esso and so on, because these companies now realize for them traditional chemical engineering graduates don't facilitate their future strategy and direction of what they're going to be doing in the next 20 to 30 years. Likewise, with automotive manufacturers, they're realizing they have to recruit lots of electrical engineers to develop these autonomous vehicles. For chemical engineers, traditionally, all these chemical engineering companies, they realize they have to recruit biochemical engineers to develop the biological activity within their companies. Here's just a very quick overview of 2 key alumni for different reasons. So Carol is one of our alumni within the department, and she is now Vice President of Medicine and Process Delivery at GSK. So one of the most senior individuals within the organization in what is a multinational billion-dollar company. And she sits on our Industrial Training Advisory Board. So Carol comes regularly back to UCL to ensure the content we're delivering is industrially relevant. So the content we're teaching is what is happening and what is needed at the industrial level. And likewise with Ewan. So Ewan was one of our graduates. He actually graduated the year after I did, so in 2009. In his undergraduate, went on to do an ND, and with one of our academics here and with another colleague here at UCL, set up his own company called Puridify. Now, Puridify is a really interesting company. It was a purification technology. It was developed out of research that was established within our department. During his ND, he took some modules from the London Business School to kind of get that commercial expertise, especially when you're starting to think about spinning out a company. You need to have that management and financial acumen. That company now, Purify, it was valued at about £4 or £5 million. It has now been bought out by GE Healthcare, one of the largest companies, again, globally. And so now Ewan and his colleague, Ollie, are now, their company has been acquired by GE Healthcare. And the amount that it was acquired for is not disclosed to the public, but I know that Ollie did buy a house in North London without a mortgage at the end of that deal. So I imagine it was worth quite a huge amount. But that's, again, within our DNA, within the department, is we want to support our students and make sure that we give them not just the engineering skill sets or the biology skill sets, but the translational skills to develop new companies, or if they want to be creative and become entrepreneurial, we can support that and facilitate that. And from our department, we've now had, I think, a total of 4 spin-out companies from our department alone. The final slide I have is around one of our legends. So Professor Barry Buckland did his PhD in UCL back in 1974. He was actually here 2 weeks ago, just having a conversation. At his prime, he was a vice president of one of the largest companies globally, Merck, where he was leading up their vaccine activity and development of multiple products. So Professor Barry Buckland is one of the most well-respected industrialists in the sector globally. In the US, he sat on a number of government panels. At UCL, he still comes back and delivers teaching material, but also, again, sits on our industrial training advisory board. So we're making sure that our content is not just world leading, but it's also what the industry needs as well, so that we give our students the best chance to be employed moving forward. So just to kind of wrap up, why study biochemical engineering and why do it at UCL? Well, firstly, to do it at UCL, we're the only university in the country to offer biochemical engineering as a full degree program. Any other university offers it with chemical engineering, and then you might get some modules or a year of biochemical engineering. We're the only university to offer it as a full degree. It allows you to begin your process of becoming a chartered engineer. So I've recently gone through that process now and have become a chartered engineer and chartered scientist, which is accredited by the IChemE. You join a global network of professionals, as I mentioned, of some of the key people globally. And also it allows, one of the things we're very, very keen on across UCL, but certainly within the department, is to bring our world-leading research into the teaching activity. So from a research perspective as well, you're getting all of the latest breaking information, and that can help you facilitate your career moving forward. So with that, I'd just like to thank you very much for your attention. There's some contact details there. Do leave your contact details, or I'm sure Kim has them, but we'll make sure that you get a copy of the slides if you'd like afterwards as well, so you can study in a bit more depth. But if you need to contact myself or Brenda, who is our undergraduate submission tutor, regarding any questions you might have at this stage, feel free to do so. So I'd like to open up the floor to any questions initially, because I know that was a lot to take in. So I don't know if there are any immediate questions or burning questions, but I'm sure things will emerge as we go on various tours and so on.